5 or 6 years ago, I took a trip by auto up from the continental United States to Alaska, and I would not recommend that. It was days and weeks of driving, paying for increasingly expensive hamburgers, like $10, $15 hamburgers, for something that you would be comparable to a fast food hamburger. Gas at $4 and $4.50. Huge stretches where behind you for 500 miles and in front of you for 500 miles. You'd probably had a hard time finding a mechanic if you had any problems. But during that trip, I made that with a daughter and her husband, and she had married a Ukrainian, and he's just a great guy. He has just many attributes. It's excellent. And during that trip, as you can imagine, with those days and weeks of driving, we talked about any number of subjects. And when he realized, and he knew it before, that I was a prepper, he shared with us the experience of his grandfather. So it was not his words. As a matter of fact, as he started relating his grandfather's experience, literally the syntax and the sentences changed, and you could tell it was really the grandfather who was speaking. And this grandfather was quite the individual by all accounts, and the sort of person you'd love to have met, although he passed away. But evidently in World War II, he had chosen to fight on the Russian army's behalf. And in fact, as I understand it, was awarded like the hero of the Soviet Union, which I understand is equivalent to like an American Medal of Honor. So he must have been born in the early 20s, and he must have experienced the great famine of the Ukraine, where it's estimated that from 5 to 13 million people were starved to death at the direction of Stalin, in my opinion. As a matter of fact, because of this incident where he related his grandfather's experience, I later read a book called Execution by Hunger and made a videotape on that. But here's what he related to us. He said, when there is hunger, when there is famine, and you have no money, you go and you collect bones, and you ask for people to give you their bones. And then through the winter, you take the bones and you just boil them, and you hope there is enough bone marrow, fat, and calories to keep you going through the winter. And my daughter and I just sat there sort of, wow. And then he says, if you have a little bit of money, you buy fat, just pure fat, and you put the fat in with the bone marrow. And this is a tremendous help. And you have bone and fat soup. And we once again, the daughter and I were like, wow. And then he says, and if you have a little bit more money, then you buy meat and you store it somehow. You freeze it, you salt it, you make jerky out of it. But if you have even more money, then you can buy vegetables, and you can have potatoes and vegetables, and you put those in a root cellar. And my daughter and I, we were just in almost silence. And he says, you know, the first person to starve to death is the mother. And the mother does not just stop eating. She cuts way down on her food intake so that she can give her food to her children. But oftentimes she becomes so weak she dies of disease and illness, or she starves to death. And then the next person that starves to death is the grandmother, because she repeats the actions of the mother. She cuts back on her food intake so much that she dies of illness or starvation. And then finally that only leaves the grandfather. And sometimes, sadly, even the grandfather repeats the actions of cutting back on his food so much that he dies of illness or starvation. And then it is truly desperate times. The children are taken to an orphanage. And being at an orphanage during times of famine it's only a slim chance that you will survive. And I said, well, where was the father in all of this? And he said, oh, when there's such great famine, there's wars all around, and the fathers leave for the wars with the army. And many times they never come back. And this is why often it's very common to find from that era that the grandfather raised the grandchildren. And my daughter and I just sat in silence. And then Sergei made a final point. He says, yes, you Americans, you see the half full glass is half full or half empty. But a Ukrainian looks at it and says, thank God we have water. Another story that Sergei shared with us was after the war, in his grandfather's village, he received orders that he and the other Russian army veterans from World War II were to muster at the headquarters for the Russian general responsible for that district. And they were quite concerned about this because it had all been discharged from the Russian army, but evidently at that time and place, when a Russian army general asked you to muster, you mustered. So he said his grandfather and the other veterans from the village went to the headquarters and they formed a formation, and the Russian general came out and he told them the reason why he had them come was there was now being made funds available for war memorials. And he wanted them to, on their own, decide what sort of war memorial they wanted for the village. That perhaps they wanted to honor his grandfather as a hero of the Soviet Union, or perhaps honor all of them. But they were to come back in several days and present to him what they felt should be the memorial in the town. A few days later, after much discussion, they came back and they had elected that Sergei's grandfather, his grandfather should be the one that presented what they had come up with. So his grandfather stepped up and respectfully shared with the Russian general that they had talked all about different memorials to the service that they had provided during World War II. But in all humbleness, they'd come up with a unique proposal. He said, in the village during the 1930s, when there was great famine, and during World War II, when food was scarce, there was a local lake with this special type of fish that whenever they had nothing, they knew they could go to the lake and they could catch enough of these fish that it would carry them through for the next several weeks. And so they were proposing that a monument be made to the fish in the lake. And he said the Russian general just stared at him and then started laughing. And he says, I love it. I love it. This is such a Russian thing. He says, yes, let's build a monument to the fish that sustain the local village. And Sergei says to this day, when you go to that lake, there is a monument to the fish in the lake. Be prepared.